I was 26 when I decided to camp near the old graveyard. It wasn't for thrills or some dumb challenge. I wasn't that kind of person. I just needed a quiet place, away from everything. Life had been weighing on me, pressing down like a thick fog. I figured a couple of nights under the open sky, away from people, would help clear my head. The place I picked was a small cemetery on the outskirts of a rural town, somewhere deep in the middle of nowhere. I had driven for hours, leaving behind the city and its noise. The graveyard was old, barely maintained, with leaning headstones and patches of tall grass overtaking the area. It sat on the edge of a dense forest, the kind that looked endless when you stood at its border. I parked my truck on the dirt road nearby and grabbed my gear. It was late afternoon, the sky was overcast, and there was that crisp autumn chill in the air. The wind had that damp, earthy scent that always came before rain. I slung my backpack over my shoulders and started walking toward the graveyard. The moment I stepped inside, I felt the weight of the place. Not fear, not anything supernatural, just the heavy silence of it. No birds chirping, no distant sounds of cars, just stillness. I found a small clearing near the edge of the cemetery, close to the tree line but not too far from the gravestones. It seemed like the best spot, a little secluded but not deep into the woods. The ground was firm, mostly dry despite the season. I set up my tent quickly, the fabric snapping in the wind as I secured the stakes. I rolled out my sleeping bag and got everything in order before the sun dipped too low. By the time I finished, the light had started fading. The sky turned a deep shade of gray, thick clouds creeping in, threatening rain. I gathered some wood from the forest floor and built a small fire, just enough to keep warm. Sitting there, staring into the flames, I let my mind wander. It had been a rough few months. Work was a mess, and everything in my personal life felt like it was unraveling. I just needed space to think. As night fully set in, the cold became sharper. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and checked my watch. It was just after 9. The fire crackled, filling the silence with occasional pops and shifts. I stared out into the graveyard, the headstones barely visible in the dim light. Something about the place started to feel different. Not wrong, not terrifying, just off. Maybe it was the way the wind had suddenly died down, leaving the air unnaturally still. Or maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to stretch a little too far. I shook the feeling off. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. A few minutes later, I heard something, a rustling in the tall grass. It was soft at first, barely noticeable over the fire's crackling. Then it stopped. I sat up, listening. Silence. I convinced myself it was just the wind or maybe an animal passing through. But the feeling in my gut didn't settle. I kept my eyes on the darkness beyond the fire's reach, scanning the shadows for any movement. Nothing. I sighed and leaned back, trying to relax. Then, another sound. Not rustling this time, something heavier. A footstep. It was close. Too close. I grabbed the flashlight beside me and flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the graveyard. The white light cut through the dark, revealing nothing but stone and overgrown grass. My heart pounded. I turned the light toward the trees. The trunks stood like tall, dark pillars, unmoving. Then, just for a second, I thought I saw something shift between them. A shape, a figure. I tensed, gripping the flashlight tighter. I aimed the beam directly at where I had seen the movement, but there was nothing there. Just trees and darkness. I swallowed hard. My breath felt too loud in the stillness. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe my eyes were just adjusting to the dark, playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I forced myself to calm down, to focus. If it was an animal, I needed to be careful. If it was a person, I didn't even want to finish that thought. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. Eventually, the fire burned low. The air grew colder. I didn't want to let it go out completely, but I also didn't want to waste the little wood I had left. Reluctantly, I crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight. The fabric felt too thin, too fragile. I lay there, listening to the quiet. Every small sound outside made my skin crawl. Then the footsteps started again. Slow, deliberate. They weren't coming from the forest this time. They were inside the graveyard. I held my breath. My mind raced. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. A long silence followed. Then, something pressed against the fabric. A shape just barely visible through the thin material. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. I lay there for what felt like forever, heart pounding. I couldn't bring myself to move. At some point, exhaustion won. My body shut down, dragging me into a restless sleep. When I woke up, the fire was out. The air was colder than before, damp and heavy. I unzipped the tent slowly, peeking out. The graveyard looked the same as it had the night before, silent, still. But something was different. The ground around my tent had been disturbed. Footprints. They circled the tent, some leading toward the trees, others vanishing into the tall grass. My stomach twisted. I packed up my things as fast as I could, my hands shaking. Every second felt like I was being watched. I didn't stop to eat, didn't stop to think. I just grabbed my gear and left. By the time I reached my truck, my nerves were shot. I started the engine and pulled onto the dirt road, glancing in the rearview mirror as I drove away. The graveyard disappeared behind me, swallowed by the trees. I didn't look back again, and I never went back. I never liked camping much. My wife, Rebecca, on the other hand, loved it. She grew up with a father who took her hunting and fishing, taught her to track animals, and made her feel at home in the wilderness. It was different for me. I wasn't raised that way. I liked knowing that if something went wrong, I could call for help and someone would show up. But Rebecca was a cop. More than that, she was tough, capable, and confident. So when she told me she had a few days off and wanted to go deep into the woods, just the two of us, I couldn't say no. She picked the spot, someplace far out in the forests of Washington, near an old trailhead she used to go to as a kid. It wasn't an official campsite. There was no ranger station, no marked trails, no other people around. Just trees, dirt, and the cold air of early autumn. I wasn't thrilled, but I told myself it would be fine. We had plenty of supplies, a good tent, and Rebecca had brought her duty weapon just in case. The drive took us nearly 6 hours. First on highways, then winding back roads, then finally a long stretch of uneven dirt that seemed to go on forever. By the time we reached a good place to set up camp, the sun was already getting low. The trees were tall and thick, and the air smelled like damp earth and pine needles. It was beautiful, I had to admit, but something about it made me uneasy. We pitched the tent near a small clearing, with just enough open space for a fire. Rebecca made quick work of setting up, while I gathered some wood. The quiet was unsettling. No distant hum of traffic, no sounds of people. Just the wind through the trees and the occasional rustling of small animals. By the time we had a fire going and some food cooked, night had fully settled in. The darkness was thick, pressing in from all sides. Our little fire seemed small against the vastness of the woods. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like something was just beyond the reach of the light. Rebecca noticed. "You all right?" she asked, though I could tell she wasn't too concerned. She was comfortable here. I wasn't. I nodded and forced a smile. "Just not used to it." She smirked, but didn't push. We sat in silence for a while, eating, listening to the fire crackle. The stars were out, bright and endless. It should have been peaceful. Then, somewhere off in the trees, a branch snapped. It wasn't a small twig, not the sound of a raccoon or rabbit scurrying through the underbrush. It was something bigger, something that took deliberate steps. My stomach tightened. Rebecca's posture shifted instantly. She was calm but alert. She set her plate down slowly, listening. Another step, then another. It was hard to tell how far away it was. The trees' distorted sound made it hard to judge distance. Probably just a deer, I said, trying to convince myself more than anything. Rebecca didn't respond. She just stared into the darkness, waiting. After a few moments, the sound stopped. The woods went quiet again. Too quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves. Just silence. It stretched on for what felt like forever. Finally, Rebecca exhaled and shook her head. "Could be anything," she said, more to herself than me. But I could tell she wasn't convinced. We finished eating, put the fire down to embers, and climbed into the tent. Rebecca kept her gun within arm's reach, tucked just beside her sleeping bag. I lay there for a long time, listening. Every little noise felt magnified. I could hear the wind, the occasional creak of tree branches, but nothing else. Eventually, exhaustion won out and I drifted off. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. First, I didn't know why. Then I heard it, soft, slow footsteps just outside the tent. Not an animal. Not the clumsy, erratic movement of a deer or bear. These were careful, deliberate, human. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The footsteps circled the tent once, then stopped. I could feel my heart hammering. Whoever it was, they were just standing there, inches from the thin fabric separating us. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see Rebecca. She was already awake, eyes open, body tense. She had one hand on her gun. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away. Slow, steady, fading into the trees. Neither of us moved for a long time. Then, barely above a whisper, Rebecca said, "Stay here." Before I could even think to argue, she was up, gun in hand, unzipping the tent as quietly as possible. She stepped out into the night, silent, controlled. I stayed where I was, every muscle in my body locked up. I listened as she took a few careful steps away, then more silence. Minutes passed. Then I heard her voice, low and firm. "Come out. Now." A pause. Then something moving. "Who are you?" she asked. No response. A few more seconds, then footsteps. Fast, retreating into the forest. I heard Rebecca take a few steps after them, but she didn't follow. Then she was back. She zipped up the tent, sat down beside me, gun still in her hand. "It was a man," she said after a long moment. "Didn't see his face. He was just standing there." My skin crawled. "What did he do?" "Nothing," she said. "Just watching." Neither of us slept after that. We kept the fire going the rest of the night, watching the trees, waiting. But whoever it was didn't come back. The first light, we packed up. We didn't talk much. There was no question of staying another night. As we hiked back to the car, I kept looking over my shoulder. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. By the time we reached the car and started driving, I felt like I could breathe again. But as we pulled onto the main road, I noticed something. On the dirt, just a few feet from where we had parked, there were footprints. Not ours. They led from the trees, stopped near the car, then turned back. Whoever it was had been watching us before we even set up camp. I never went camping again. It was late October, right before the cold set in for good. The leaves were thick on the ground, the kind that crunched under your boots, and the air had that damp smell of decay. I had taken a week off work to go deep into the woods for a hunting trip. Just me, my rifle, and my gear. I'd been planning it for months, mapping out the area, checking reports of game movement, making sure I had the right supplies. I wanted to be alone, away from the noise of people, the stress of work, everything. I'd done this before several times, but this time would be different. I drove for hours before I reached the old logging road. It wasn't marked on newer maps, but I had found it years ago, a forgotten stretch of dirt and rocks that led deep into a forest few people ever set foot in. I had to park miles away from my intended camping spot, the rest of the way on foot. That was part of the appeal. If you could drive all the way in, it meant too many people had been there. I wanted to be in real wilderness, somewhere untouched, where the animals still behaved like animals, not half-tame creatures used to seeing humans. The hike was rough. My pack was heavy, loaded with enough supplies to last me a week, plus my rifle slung over my shoulder. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. No road noise, no hum of distant civilization. Just the wind through the trees, the occasional crack of a branch underfoot, and the rustling of unseen creatures moving in the undergrowth. That was the best part of it. The silence. I reached my planned camping spot just before dusk. It was a small clearing, not too exposed, with a good view of the valley below. The tree cover was thick enough to keep me hidden, but not so dense that it blocked the sky. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and sat back to watch the sunset. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal, listened to the distant hoots of owls, and went to sleep early, knowing I'd be up before dawn to start tracking. The second day started as any good hunting trip should. I woke in the dark, packed up what I needed, and moved quietly through the trees. The cold bit at my fingers as I gripped my rifle, and every breath came out in a mist. I tracked fresh deer sign, found a good position, and waited. Hours passed. That's the thing about hunting. It's mostly waiting. You sit there, still as a rock, listening, watching. The forest moves around you, barely noticing you're there. By midday, I finally had some luck. A buck, big and healthy, moved into the clearing about 70 yards away. I lined up my shot, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle shattered the stillness. The deer jumped, stumbled, and ran. I waited a few minutes before following, making sure I didn't push it too soon. Tracking a wounded animal isn't easy. Even with a clean shot, they can run for quite a while. I found a good blood trail, dark red drops against the yellow leaves, and started following. The terrain got rougher, sloping down into thick brush. I moved slowly, carefully, scanning ahead for movement. Then I found something that made me stop. A second blood trail. It wasn't from the deer. It was fresh, smeared on the leaves, leading off in a different direction. That didn't make sense. I'd only fired one shot. There shouldn't have been another wounded animal. My first thought was that maybe a predator had been nearby, maybe a cougar or a bear, and had gotten itself caught in the crossfire. But I hadn't seen anything else when I took the shot. I stood there for a long time, listening. The forest felt different now, too quiet.
No birds, no rustling.
Just stillness. I should have left it alone. I should have kept tracking the deer, gotten my kill, and gone back to camp. But something about that second blood trail got under my skin. It looked different, thicker, smeared, like whatever was bleeding had been moving slow, maybe dragging itself. I followed it. The deeper I went, the worse it got. The blood was heavier now, staining the ground in big, dark patches. The trees were thick, closing in around me, and the undergrowth was dense, making every step an effort. I started seeing broken branches, signs of struggle. Something had gone through here in a bad way. Then I found the first piece of fabric. It was caught on a branch, dark and stiff with dried blood. At first, I thought maybe a poacher had been injured, maybe someone hunting illegally, but the further I went, the less that made sense. The blood wasn't old, hadn't been there long. Then I smelled it, that thick, coppery stink of blood and something worse. Rot. I should have turned back. I should have walked away, but I didn't. I kept going, my rifle raised, my heart hammering in my chest. Then I saw it. A boot, half buried in the leaves. Not just any boot. An old, worn-out hiking boot, laces undone, the leather cracked with age. And it wasn't empty. The foot inside was swollen, discolored. The leg ended just below the knee, torn, ragged flesh where something had ripped it apart. I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting. My brain tried to make sense of it. An animal attack? Maybe. But why was the rest of the body nowhere in sight? I scanned the trees, every shadow suddenly looking like a threat. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get back to camp, to get out of those woods. I turned, ready to move, when I heard it, a rustling, close. I froze. My grip tightened on my rifle. Then, through the trees, I saw movement. Not an animal, not a bear, a man. He was standing there, half hidden in the shadows, watching me. His clothes were filthy, torn, stained with something dark. His face was wrong, gaunt, hollowed-out eyes, sunken cheeks. His hands were shaking, but he didn't move. I raised my rifle. He didn't react. Then he took a step forward. Slow, deliberate. I backed up, my breath coming fast now. My mind screamed at me to run, but I held my ground, my rifle locked on him. Then he smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was wrong, stretched too wide, too unnatural. I turned and ran. I crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at my face. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if he was following. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs felt like they were going to burst. When I reached my campsite, I grabbed my pack, shoved everything inside in a panic, and started moving. I didn't stop. I hiked back the way I came, my rifle in one hand, my other gripping my knife. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. When I finally looked back, the woods were still. But I knew he was there, watching. I never went back. I had always liked camping, though I wouldn't call myself an expert. I wasn't one of those guys who packed ultralight gear and trekked deep into the wild for weeks, but I knew my way around the basics. I had a decent tent, a good sleeping bag, and enough common sense to stay safe. In the summer of 2017, I decided to take a solo camping trip to clear my head. Work had been stressful, and I felt the need to get away from everything. I picked a spot about 3 hours from home, a quiet, lesser-known area in the mountains where I wouldn't have to deal with crowds. It wasn't a fully remote area, but it also wasn't one of those overdeveloped campgrounds with paved roads and picnic tables. Just a dirt path leading into the woods, a few scattered fire rings, and nothing else. It was the kind of place where you might see another camper's tent through the trees if you looked hard enough, but you'd probably never hear them. I arrived in the afternoon and parked at the end of the dirt road. My pack wasn't too heavy, and the hike to the campsite was only about a mile. It was a warm day, the kind where the heat sinks into your skin, but there was a breeze moving through the trees. The scent of pine and damp earth filled the air. I took my time walking, enjoying the quiet. The campsite I chose was perfect. Flat ground, a good clearing, and a fallen log that would make a decent bench near the fire ring. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and gathered some firewood before it got dark. As the sun started to set, I built a fire and cooked a simple meal. The forest was peaceful, the kind of place where your only company was the sound of the wind moving through the leaves. I didn't see any animals except for a few birds and a squirrel that watched me from a tree branch. It was exactly what I needed, a break from the noise of everyday life. The first night was uneventful. I lay in my tent, listening to the distant hoot of an owl and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. I wasn't worried. I had camped enough to know that most sounds in the woods come from small creatures. Rabbits, raccoons, or even just the wind shifting branches. I drifted off to sleep easily. It was the second night when things started to feel off. That day, I spent my time exploring. I hiked further into the woods, following an old game trail. There was no real destination, I just liked the feeling of wandering. After a few hours, I found a small stream and filled my water bottle. The sun was high, and I sat on a rock for a while, letting the cool air off the water dry the sweat on my skin. That's when I noticed it. A sound. Not close, but not far either. A snap like a branch breaking. It wasn't a small twig either. It was loud, the kind of noise something big would make if it stepped on a dry limb. I froze, listening. Silence. I scanned the trees, looking for movement, but everything was still. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a bear. Black bears were common enough in the area, but they weren't aggressive unless provoked. Still, something about it unsettled me. I had been in the woods all day and hadn't seen so much as a deer track. Now, suddenly, something big was nearby. I waited another minute, listening. Nothing. Just the wind, the stream, and the occasional rustle of leaves. Eventually, I shrugged it off and started heading back to camp. By the time I got back, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. I built another fire and ate my dinner, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination, just the kind of paranoia that sneaks up on you when you're alone in the woods. The fire burned low, and I climbed into my tent. I lay there for a long time, listening to the night. The usual sounds were there, the wind, the insects, the occasional distant owl. But something was missing. The underbrush was silent. That was what bothered me. Normally, you hear little creatures moving around at night. Mice, rabbits, raccoons. But the woods were completely still. It was around midnight when I heard it again. A snap. Closer this time. My breath caught in my throat. I lay there, perfectly still, my ears straining. Another snap. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't random. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Moving through the trees just beyond my campsite. I reached for my knife. I always kept it close when I camped, not because I expected trouble, but because it was a good habit. I gripped it tightly, my heart pounding. The footsteps stopped. The silence stretched. I didn't move. I don't know how long I stayed like that. 5 minutes, 10, maybe longer. Eventually, I convinced myself that I had imagined it. The wind, a falling branch, something normal. But then a sound. Soft. Breathing. Not mine. Just outside my tent. My stomach turned to ice. I had never been so aware of my own breathing. How loud it sounded in the silence. I didn't move. The breathing stayed there for what felt like forever. Slow. Steady. Then footsteps. Moving away. Not quickly. Not running. Just walking. The way a person walks when they're not in a hurry. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, gripping my knife, listening. I didn't hear anything else, but I knew I wasn't alone. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed my gear. I didn't bother eating. I didn't even fully collapse my tent. I just stuffed everything into my pack as fast as I could. The walk back to my car felt longer than it should have. Every sound put me on edge. The wind through the branches, the rustle of leaves. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone step out from behind a tree, but I never saw anything. I made it to my car, threw my pack in the back, and got in. I locked the doors before I even started the engine. I didn't relax until I was miles away, back on the main road, the trees disappearing in my rearview mirror. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't know what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure. I was not alone. I never planned to camp alone, but things don't always go the way you expect. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. My friend Mark and I had picked a remote spot in the forests of Montana, far from any towns or even well-traveled trails. He had to back out at the last minute because of work, but I decided to go anyway. I had all the gear I needed. I had been camping for years, and I figured a few nights alone in the wilderness would do me some good. I arrived at the trailhead in the early afternoon and hiked for several miles until I found a clearing near a small creek. The spot was perfect: flat ground, plenty of firewood, and no sign of other campers. It was quiet, the kind of quiet you only get deep in the wilderness. The wind moved through the trees, and every now and then, I heard the distant sound of running water. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and got a fire going before it got dark. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some food over the fire, listened to the sounds of the forest, and eventually crawled into my sleeping bag. I slept well, only waking up once when a raccoon rustled around near my tent. In the morning, I made coffee, ate breakfast, and decided to do some exploring. I followed the creek upstream for a while, taking in the scenery. The forest was dense, but I wasn't worried about getting lost. I had a GPS and had marked my camp's location. As I walked, I noticed something strange. The trees ahead of me had deep scratches in them, long and jagged. It looked like something had been clawing at them. I stopped and took a closer look. The marks were too high up for a coyote or a mountain lion. Maybe a bear, I thought. That was unsettling, but not enough to make me turn back. I was carrying bear spray and a knife, and I knew the basics of dealing with wildlife. I kept moving. I found something else a little further along, a small pile of bones. They were stripped clean, white against the forest floor, probably the remains of a deer. The sight made me uneasy, but again, I told myself it was just nature running its course. I took a few pictures, then turned back toward camp. As I walked, I started to feel strange. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something felt wrong. The forest seemed quieter than before. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. I picked up my pace. The feeling didn't go away, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. When I got back to camp, I checked my surroundings carefully. Nothing was out of place. My tent was untouched, my gear right where I left it. I forced myself to relax. I made lunch, read for a while, and chopped some more wood. By the time the sun started to set, I had convinced myself that I had just let my imagination get the best of me. That night, I woke up to a sound. A single, sharp crack like a branch breaking. My eyes snapped open and I lay still, listening. Nothing. Then, a few moments later, another sound. Closer. A rustling, then silence again. I reached for my flashlight and slowly unzipped my tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow around the clearing. I scanned the trees but saw nothing. Still, my heart was pounding. I stayed like that for a long time, barely breathing, waiting. But whatever it was, it didn't make another sound. After a while, I convinced myself it had just been an animal passing through. I zipped the tent back up and tried to sleep. The next morning, I found tracks near my camp. Human tracks. They weren't mine. The prints were fresh, leading from the tree line to the edge of my camp, then back into the woods. Someone had been here while I slept. I felt a deep, cold dread settle in my stomach. I had been alone all this time, or at least I thought I had been. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw no sign of anyone. I didn't waste time. I packed up my gear quickly, throwing everything into my pack. My plan had been to stay another night, but that wasn't happening. I was getting out. I started down the trail, moving fast but trying to stay quiet. My ears were on high alert, listening for any sound of movement behind me. I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hike back to my truck felt twice as long as it had on the way in. Every time I turned a corner or passed through a thick stretch of trees, I expected to see someone standing there. When I finally reached the parking area, my truck was just as I left it. I threw my pack in the back and got inside, locking the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look back as I pulled onto the dirt road and drove away. I don't know who was out there. Maybe just some other camper, maybe a hunter. But I can't shake the feeling that they weren't just passing through. They had been watching me, and they had waited until I was asleep to come closer. I haven't been camping alone since. I never thought much about camping alone. It was something I had done plenty of times before, and it had always been peaceful. I liked the quiet, the break from everything. No phone service, no city noise, no distractions. Just the trees, the wind, the crackling fire. This trip was no different. I had driven out to a remote part of the woods in northern Michigan, far from any designated campground, where I knew I wouldn't see another soul. I preferred it that way. I had my tent, my gear, enough food for a few days. I set up by a small clearing not too far from a narrow river. The trees were dense, towering overhead, their branches reaching so high they blocked out most of the sky. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves or the chirping of birds. I spent the first afternoon setting up camp, gathering firewood, making sure everything was in place. I always followed the same routine: keep everything organized, stay prepared. I wasn't worried about animals, this wasn't bear country, but I still kept my food locked away and my knife within reach. It was a habit, nothing more. That first night was quiet. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, listening to the wind move through the trees. I had a book with me, but I didn't read much. I just sat there, enjoying the stillness, the solitude. When I finally crawled into my tent and lay down in my sleeping bag, I felt completely at ease. I woke up to something moving outside my tent. It wasn't loud, just the faintest crunch of leaves, the smallest disturbance in the night. I lay still, listening. Animals moved through the woods all the time, raccoons, deer, maybe a fox. But this didn't sound like an animal. It was slow, deliberate. A single footstep, then another, then silence. I stayed completely still, my heart pounding. The fire had died down to embers, and my tent was zipped shut. I had no way of seeing outside. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly, listening. Nothing. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I strained my ears, waiting for another sound. But there was nothing. No wind, no insects, no movement, just silence. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe I had imagined it. I told myself it didn't matter. I was in the middle of nowhere. No one else should be out here. I tried to sleep, but it took a long time before I finally drifted off. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and looked around. Everything seemed normal. My gear was undisturbed. Nothing had been touched, but something felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there the night before. I decided to stay an extra day. I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't spooked, that I wasn't being paranoid. I spent the morning hiking, following the river upstream, taking in the crisp air. The woods were beautiful, untouched. No signs of other people.
No footprints. No campsites.
By the time I got back to camp, the sun was starting to set. I built up the fire again, ate my dinner, and sat in the same spot as the night before. But this time, I couldn't relax. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees, waiting for something to move. Nothing did. Hours passed. The fire burned low. The air got colder. Eventually, I forced myself to crawl into my tent and lie down. I didn't sleep. I don't know what time it was when I heard it again. A footstep, closer this time, then another. I I gripped my knife so tight my hand hurt. I waited, barely breathing. Silence. Then something brushed against the side of my tent. Not hard, just a faint touch. A slow, deliberate press. I shot up, heart hammering, trying to stay quiet. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and shone it at the fabric. Nothing. I turned it off, listening, waiting. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Then I heard it. A long, slow exhale, right outside my tent. Not an animal. Person. I felt my blood turn to ice. My grip on the knife tightened. I waited. Then, slowly, the footsteps moved away. I don't know how long I sat there in the darkness, listening, waiting for them to come back. But they didn't. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless, uneasy sleep. When I woke up, the first thing I did was check around my tent. There were footprints. Human. They circled my tent, stopped by the fire, then disappeared into the woods. I packed up my gear in record time. I didn't eat, didn't rest. I shoved everything into my backpack and started hiking back toward my truck. The entire way I felt watched. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my heart race. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, but I never did. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear inside and locked the doors. I sat there for a long time, staring at the trees, waiting for someone to step out. Nothing did. I started the engine and drove away. I never went back to that spot again. I set up camp just before sunset, deep in the woods where the trees grew thick and the undergrowth tangled at my feet. The forecast had called for rain, but I wasn't worried. I had packed accordingly: waterproof tarp, a sturdy tent, extra clothes, and enough food to last a couple of days. I had done this countless times before, camping alone in remote areas where the only sounds were the rustling leaves and distant calls of birds. I liked the isolation. I liked the quiet. This time, I had chosen a spot near a small clearing, not too far from a narrow dirt road that barely passed for a trail. I had driven my truck as far as it would go before the road became too rough, then hiked in about 2 miles with my gear. I wanted to be far enough from any signs of civilization, but still within a reasonable walking distance if something went wrong. The air was already thick with humidity, and the sky had taken on a dull gray hue, signaling the coming rain. I worked quickly, setting up my tent and securing the tarp above it, angling it so the water would run off to the side instead of pooling on top. The ground was dry for now, but I knew that wouldn't last. I gathered firewood before the rain started, stacking it under the tarp to keep it from getting soaked. I had no cell service out here. That was part of the reason I came, to disconnect, to be away from everything. But it also meant that if something happened, I was on my own. I didn't think much of it. I had been doing this for years, and nothing had ever gone seriously wrong. By the time the first raindrops began to fall, I had a fire going and was heating up a can of chili. The smell of it mixed with the damp earth, the scent of wet pine and smoke. The sound of rain tapping against the tarp was oddly comforting, a steady rhythm that filled the silence. I sat there, eating straight from the can, watching the fire dance in the dimming light. The rain picked up, coming down harder, but I was dry under my tarp. It was a good setup. I felt safe. But then I heard something. It wasn't the rain, wasn't the wind. It was something else. A sound just on the edge of my hearing. A crack, a snap, like a branch breaking underfoot. I looked up, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. The trees were dense, their trunks blending together into a black wall. I squinted, trying to see past the shifting shadows. Maybe it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon, but something about it didn't feel right. I sat still, listening. The rain drowned out the smaller noises, but I swore I heard something moving. Slow, deliberate, not the quick, erratic movements of an animal. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing, just wet bark and thick undergrowth. I exhaled, shaking my head at myself. I was being paranoid. I turned off the flashlight and leaned back, forcing myself to relax. The fire crackled, the rain fell, and everything was fine. But then I heard it again, closer, a distinct crunch, like a footstep sinking into damp leaves. My heart picked up speed. I sat up straighter, eyes locked on the dark. The fire's glow barely reached past my tent, leaving the rest of the forest in shadows. I listened, straining to hear past the rain, and then nothing. No more footsteps, no more rustling, just the steady drumming of rain against my tarp. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a tree limb had snapped under the weight of the water. Maybe I was imagining things, but my gut told me otherwise. I stood up, grabbing my flashlight again, this time holding it tighter. I didn't turn it on yet. I just stood there, waiting, staring into the woods. My breath was slow, controlled. I didn't want to make any sudden movements. The rain made it harder to hear, but I kept listening. Minutes passed. Nothing. I let out a breath and sat back down. Then, just as I reached for my drink, something moved. Closer this time. My stomach clenched. I flicked on the flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. A figure. For a split second, I saw it tall just at the edge of the trees. But as soon as the light hit it, it moved. Quick. Too quick. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding. I pointed the flashlight back, but it was gone. The woods were empty. I swallowed hard. My first thought was that it was another camper, but no one else should have been out here. Not this deep, not in this rain. I scanned the trees again, my grip tightening around the flashlight. Nothing moved, but I knew what I had seen. I forced myself to breathe. My mind ran through my options. I could pack up and leave, but hiking back in the dark, in the rain, wasn't safe. My truck was miles away. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe it was just someone passing through. Maybe they hadn't even seen me, but that didn't explain the way they moved. I kept the flashlight in my hand, sat back down, and kept the fire going. If someone was out there, I wanted them to know I was awake, alert. The rain didn't let up. The wind picked up slightly, making the trees sway, their branches creaking. Hours passed. I didn't sleep. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it again. This time, it was closer. I turned the flashlight on, aiming it toward the sound, but again, nothing, just empty trees. I stayed awake until the sky began to lighten. The rain had stopped by then, leaving everything soaked. I packed up quickly, every muscle in my body tense. I didn't even eat. I just wanted to leave. The hike back to my truck was the longest I had ever done. Every step I felt watched. I didn't see anything, didn't hear anything, but I knew. I knew something had been out there. I reached my truck just as the sun started breaking through the clouds. I threw my gear in the back, climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced back toward the tree line, and that's when I saw it, standing just beyond the trees, half hidden in the shadows. Watching me, I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just drove, and I never went back.